Hey guys, Happy New Year and welcome back to another episode of 5 Drinks to Midnight. You know the show where we bring the questions, guests bring the drinks, we try to wrap up before midnight. Today we're headed down to Tavel Bar here in Brooklyn. Talk to Schragis from Barrell Craft Spirits. But before we do, like and subscribe. Really help us out. Happy New Year. Let's get started. Will, thank you so much for joining us here at Tavel Bar. Mike, thank you for hosting us at Tavel Bar. Thanks for joining me tonight. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so glad this finally worked out. I know we've been back and forth for months now.
Yeah, no.
Find a time, find a perfect venue, doing it in person. So excited to be here.
Again, so you guys have been so good to me this year, and again, huge fan. So again, I'm so glad that this worked out. So again, thank you so much. I guess our first question, what are we drinking first?
So we're going to drink Barrell Dovetail first.
I'll let you do the honors.
Cool. See if I can get a good cork sound.
Ooh, there we go.
Nice.
I think this is like everybody's like gateway into Barrell because again, it is so amazing. And
thank you.
Like,
it's funny. It's always so hard to decide what to pick first because everything we do is a cast strength. Cheers. But more and more over the past few years, people are always asking me about Barrell's sort of perspective on blending and moving the needle on like what whiskey making is. And there's been, 10, 15, 20 points since I started with Barrell in 2015 that have changed the trajectory of the company, either in terms of like our philosophy or our growth patterns or whatever it is. And one of the ones that I think in hindsight was most influential on what comes next was when we made Dovetail for the first time because we thought it was going to be a one-time release. We have these two pillars that our company sits on. Everything we do sort of must abide by these two pillars. And the first is we're going to make the best whiskey we can all the time, no matter what. The second is we do everything at cast strength. And at the time, when we would make a blend, we had this line, whiskey batch 1 through whiskey batch 5. We would make it one time and we move on to a totally new idea. And then we released Dovetail, which was this blend that had a name and had such a complicated set of finishes on it. And we released it in like December, made 600 cases and sold out in 2 weeks. So we had this crisis of, we have to figure out how to make the best thing no matter what, but also make more Dovetail because everyone is asking us for more Dovetail. And so what we decided is we take the three ingredients of Dovetail, which is Indiana whiskey finished in dun Cabernet barrels, and then bourbon finished in late bottle vintage port pipes, and bourbon finished in blackstrap molasses rum casks. We would make those three ingredients in perpetuity. And each time we needed to bottle Dovetail, we would blend them to taste, not to proof, to make it again. And in that, we started what has since become one of the most painstaking but most unique parts of our blending philosophy, which is we blend ingredients before we blend whiskeys so that we have more control, so that we can be more precise. We didn't realize that was going to become so important when we did it, but it was like no one was doing that before we did it, and we did it just to fix this one problem when we first launched Dovetail. So even though it's 118 to 120 proof, depending on which vatting you have, since we're talking about Barrell, I figure this is like a good first place to start.
That's awesome.
So what's really cool about Dovetail, and we get this a lot with some other whiskeys we're going to try later, but if you think of the finishes on Dovetail, the late bottle vintage port and the blackstrap molasses rum both have some residual sugar in them. So those barrels add a little bit of sweetness.
Okay.
And the port and the Cabernet are both fermentation finishes, not distillate finishes. So the thing that was in the barrel before wasn't distilled, which means there's acid in it, and there's acid present, and so there's this very mild sugar and acid balance in Dovetail. And we, like in human palates, like we love acid and sugar balance. It's why we love daiquiris. It's why we love ketchup. Like it's why we love marinara sauce.
Yep.
Like you name it. If there's like balanced acidity and sugar, it does it for us. And whiskey doesn't get that very often, with the exception of some sherry finishes, because that acid can't make it through distillation. There's not acidity in barrels. There's no way for it to get there. And so, even though Dovetail's really high proof, it's like wonderfully distracting on the palate, where like it doesn't feel like a hot whiskey. It just feels like an intensely flavorful whiskey.
Okay.
And at the time, it was a wild thing to release this, to put 3 different finishes and blend them together. And you look at where the whiskey industry is now, 4 years, 5 years later, whatever it is, and what we have done since then, and it's funny for me to go back, because I think of it as this kind of like standard in our portfolio, but then I like sort of look at it and it's still a crazy whiskey in such a cool way.
Awesome. Do you find, so like for me, like in our group, we have a lot of people that are either Dovetail or Seagrass, because like those were kind of the two, like I said, gateway drugs in the barrel. Do you find that is the community split that way? And again, not question one, but do you think that like the community is split that way, or is it? I mean, both, or are people just like, yeah, I love both?
I think it's more that Dovetail is a whiskey drinker's whiskey, and Seagrass is a spirits drinker's whiskey. A lot of people who love Seagrass are people who drink mezcal and drink Armagnac and drink sour beers and drink Miller High Lifes and drink, Grower Champagne, whatever it is, and then they also drink whiskey. And Seagrass has this like fruit forwardness and playfulness to it, and actually is very restrained in terms of its oak, and so it appeals to people who like other categories a lot. Also rye drinkers, also whiskey drinkers, but like really sort of full stop curiosity beverage people. Dovetail, though eccentric in its finishes and its secondary maturation, is actually a very classic whiskey profile, and so Dovetail to me is more like a Scotch drinker's entry into the bourbon world, or a bourbon drinker's entry into the Scotch world. It's just this like gentle but very flavorful, slightly fruit forward, high alcohol content, but like not too hot whiskey.
Okay.
It's like, but it's a whiskey drinker's whiskey for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of both. So, but yes, but all right. Question one.
Yeah.
How'd you get started in the whiskey business?
Okay, so the real answer to that is in college. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do one summer, and I was going to bartend at a place called Ruby Foods in Times Square.
Okay.
And on a whim, because I had been homebrewing in college a lot, I sent an email to every micro distillery that had just opened in New York. There weren't that many at the time. Saying like, I just really want to learn about whiskey making because I'm interested in it. I didn't think it would be a career. I just thought it would be like I'll do an internship and I'll bartend and that'll be my job. And Colin from Kings County responded and said, yeah, if you're willing to do data entry and like carry grains and deliver stuff on the subway and whatever, like, yeah, you can come and hang out and we'll show you how to distill a little bit. And I just had the best. So it's like
that's awesome.
Now I have imposter syndrome. I'm still pretty young for my job and for the industry, but I have this like glory days memory of that summer of like, I was working in this ridiculous now closed Asian fusion restaurant in Times Square, making pretty good money, but like selling chocolate banana spring rolls and lychee martinis, and then during the day I was like sitting in an unair conditioned, essentially loft studio distillery thing in Bushwick and like learning how to make bourbon, which I had no idea how it was made. And at the time there were not that many micro distilleries, so I was actually one of a couple hundred people who legally were trained as a distiller, even if it just meant early Kings County teaching me how they do their thing. So just the real like how I got into the whiskey. But then I did not do it professionally. I went to culinary school. I started working in the wine industry. I was working in restaurants in New York, and then I ended up working for an auction house where they moved me from domestic wine to whiskey or spirits. And that was right when the price of Pappy went from $600 to $2,000 a bottle, and when Macallan went from $150 to $280, and people started really collecting whiskey, though not with the hype that we have now. But and so my job got really important and because it was an auction house and a retail store, I got to meet the like sales director and stuff from all of these different companies, and that's where I met Joe, the owner and founder of Barrell. He had just launched Barrell. We were the second store to ever bring him in, and he was so nice to me, and we just like stayed in touch, and we would do things like go to Whiskey Fest and just like taste and talk about not only the whiskey but also like how brands were presenting themselves. We have this thing we talk about a lot, which is delivering on the promises of the bottles. We were like really like analyzing that, and then I left that job and I started working for a rum importer. And Joe all the time would text me and call me like, "One day you're going to work for me," and I didn't totally believe him. But then he got in touch with me and said, like, "I'm in 6 states. I want to be in 50 states. What's a good title for someone who's going to walk into a distributor?" And I was 26 at the time, and like that's. How can you say no to like an awesome whiskey maker being like, "You want to be my first employer"?
Yeah, well, I was going to say you were employee number one, correct? Like that.
Yeah. So me and then Tripp, who's we call him the chief whiskey scientist. We started. He actually started with the company as a consultant before I did, and then we both kind of worked with Joe part time or off and on. And then I was the first full time employee, although Joe's daughter Katie also has worked with the company the whole time, and she is technically employee number one in our system because she was entered first. So we all argue about who the first employer was, but for all intent and purpose, yes.
All right.
Which is cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And but too, is it true that you were underage and started a brewing club in school too?
Man, you went on like a deep dive on me.
We stalked the shit out of you. So
not totally true. The brewing club at the university I was at didn't require everyone to be 21. There just had to be someone who was 21 present, and you weren't allowed to consume beer if you weren't 21. And so there was always someone who was over 21 present at the brewing club that I was in, but my co-president and I were 20 when we were president, so we still had to have someone older than we were, tasting the beer each time. But yeah, it's really funny that so I joined the club like on a whim when I was a freshman in college, and then I got really into it, and I was.
That's awesome.
I'm a person who likes details,
all right.
And so and most brewing clubs in college don't have a person who likes details, and so we went from like 8 people making 1 beer a week to like 4 different houses each making 4 beers a week, and we ended up making 400 to 800 bottles a week of beer as a club while I was there, which was so cool now, especially being in the whiskey industry, because I feel like I have this like not understanding but at least like experience of like having to think about fermentation a lot. And when I taste whiskeys, even just in like talking to people, you learn a lot from just doing stuff. And distillation, though so important to whiskey making, like you can't be a good distiller without having good fermentation also. And as a blender, like when we're analyzing barrels and talking about like what do we like about this and why, having made 400 or 500 beers between the ages of 19 and 23, I don't want to say it's like important, but it is. It's like I have flashbacks to like what grains smell like when I'm fermenting. I mean, you can totally taste that in white whiskey and Kochners and stuff like that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And is it true that like you were one of the most funded programs in school because you guys were the largest group and it required so many hours?
Yeah.
Like,
I'm trying to think of where you may have found this. We created this unit to apply for funding called person hours. And it was how many people times how many hours do they spend in the club, and we took really, really good data. And so when we went to apply for funding from the school, they look at all the clubs the same, and so we were able to say like we have 32 people who do 4 to 6 hours per week with our club. Thus, we deserve to be funded as a serious club. And so we didn't have to pay for the ingredients for
that's
beer.
Well, I think that's a fucking awesome origin story. And again, I mean, I think just shows your passion for what you do. So again, cheers to that. So,
yeah.
All right,
ready?
Question 2, drink 2.
Yeah.
What are we drinking?
We are drinking Stellum Bourbon.
Ooh, yes.
We released Stellum about 2.5 years ago now. And it, like Barrell, is very much a blend, and it's made by the same blending team, but with a different reason for existing. a different philosophy behind it. Stellum is really dedicated to cask strength, but classic bourbon and rye profiles. So it's a very modern company in who we are and our ideas about putting whiskeys together. But rather than trying to push the envelope on what flavors you can have in whiskey, we're trying to be the best that we can at making bourbon and making rye. And so though there's special releases in Stellum, the focus is still on these core cask strength blends that we're doing. And this is the bourbon. And Stellum's, $55, $60 on the shelf. It's as cask strength bourbon go, especially ones with some age, really a fantastic value. And every time I go back to it, there's just so much complexity in it.
It's nice.
It's Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana bourbon all blended together. Much more focus on Indiana than Barrell has, although it's not single-sourced at all. I think one of the big misnomers with both Barrell and Stellum is that we rely on any one distillery for our sourcing. We work with upwards of 70 distilleries at this point. And so a lot of times when I talk to people and they try to ask me gotcha questions about where Barrell is distilled, and no one's ever totally wrong or totally right about it. It's there's a piece of it, but Joe has done such an amazing job in now 10 years of sourcing for Barrell of picking up gems, and often picking up gems in larger quantities than one might think, so that they age into different things, putting them in different places to age and get different environments, so they create more sort of variables to blend with. And so Stellum is really cool that it calls upon the distillers that have made bourbon what it is in some ways, but it also no one could put that blend together, because our sourcing and thus resting and blending regimen to make Stellum is something that no one could really unravel and redo.
Okay.
Which is it's cool to know about.
Awesome. Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh, so good. All right. So, question 2.
Yep.
You guys are known as basically a blending house, but you also have the single barrel program.
Yep.
How do you separate the two, and what's the process? Do you being oh shit, that's a magnificent barrel, that's just gonna go sit over here? Is it just that simple, or is there fuck, that's an amazing barrel, but that's never gonna work with these 3 other barrels?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we talk about this a lot, because the concept of single barrels is in some ways at odds with how we feel about whiskey, which is variety of ingredients can make things that are greater than the sums of their parts. And at the same time, we are a company that wants to listen to what people are excited about in the whiskey world and participate in the whiskey world. And single barrels are and continue to be a huge part of what people are excited about. And so we synthesize that issue, that crisis, in 2 ways. The first is we have one program that is the single barrel private release program, and available from us as exclusive picks or as limited releases are both things that were full cask strength single barrels, or things that we call private releases that were constructed using a barrel as the marrying cask. That exists in bourbon, where there'll be a roughly 180 bottle blend of anywhere between 5 and 17-year-old bourbons that go in. And it exists in the whiskey world, where we do all of these different exotic finishes on whiskey private release. And we treat those 2 programs from a sales point of view equally. If someone wants to get a pick from us, they pick single barrels, they pick private releases at the same price.
Okay.
They're made available in the same way. But from a production standpoint, they're obviously very different. The private releases are little blends that we have to make each one, and there's a huge amount of work that goes into making each one balanced and unique from other ones. The single barrels are, at almost any moment in our process, if someone on the production team identifies something as special, either because they tasted it and it's really imbalanced and it will be a filler but not special in a blend, but it's special by itself, or if something is off profile in a really fascinating way, they'll mark it and we'll sort of taste it and talk about it. And the idea with the single barrel program for us is to allow each barrel as much as we can to, I know this sounds like cliche, but live its best life.
Sure.
And the vast majority of them getting sorted and vatted into an ingredient that we can think about as one single ingredient, along with 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 others in a blend. That's what they're best for. But then there's some that will be very boring in a blend, but are really interesting by themselves and are good whiskey. And thus they end up in the single barrel program. In order to be released as a single barrel, a barrel from us has to be earmarked / approved twice. It has to be pulled out of the blending program the first time, and then has to be tasted again before it's bottled to make sure that someone on our blending team still feels like that barrel is better used by itself than it would have been otherwise.
Awesome.
There's a pretty significant number of barrels that end up back to the blending. Yeah.
Is there a time process like between from when it sits or no?
No.
Or
if you look at our single barrel program, there's the first two letters. Z1 through Z5 were the most recent releases, but there was the N1 series, and there's been a bunch of them. And each one of those have a little bit of a different story behind the set of barrels. Either they were from very different lots of barrels, but they were all picked at the same time, or it was one lot of barrels that we loved, and we picked 40 or so to go into the single barrel program. And so there's kind of a different story behind all of those. But if I go back to the two pillars of the company, no, there's no rule. The barrels that are showing best at that moment, whether they've been singled out to be part of the single barrel program before a long time ago or 2 weeks earlier, are what's going to end up in the single barrel program at that point. But what we have found in the past few years is that people are really looking to us more for the private release program, because it allows us to give people in a small exclusive release way what our company has become more and more famous for, which is teasing flavors and blending that other people aren't able to do.
Okay.
And so I love single barrel whiskey, single barrel bourbon, but what we're finding is there's less and less of that.
Cool.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Cool. Cheers.
Cheers. Question 3, drink 3. What are we drinking?
So we're here at Tavel Bar in Brooklyn, which is one of my favorite bars in the world.
Same.
It's
and Mike we trust.
Not to give Mike too much of a plug here, but I would say it's a whiskey industry bar in a major way. And they have a fantastic selection, but Mike also makes really good sort of simple whiskey cocktails. And we're about to drink one of the special releases of Distilling Rye, so I asked him to make a Distilling Rye cocktail that he has on the list here. That's a peach old-fashioned. So it's a very classic old-fashioned build, and I haven't ever had it with this whiskey. We're having Stellum Fibonacci. It's a special release of Stellum.
Awesome. Probably the most expensive cocktail ever.
It's a dangerous drink.
Oh, that's good, Mike.
Yeah, I think stirred drinks with cask strength good whiskey are about as dangerous as it comes.
Yeah, definitely. There's. I think you nailed it in the question 1. You were saying if it is balanced, then it is sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a very dangerous.
And so I know we were talking about Stellum bourbon before, but so in Stellum we make Stellum bourbon, we make Stellum rye, and then periodically a couple times a year we release what we call a Stellum black or a Stellum specialty. And that is a blend that we're not going to be able to recreate. Stellum's always the same in its core offerings, but they're really back to our roots of small batch bourbon and small batch rye, but using the Stellum profile as its base. And so I get the question all the time, what's the difference between a batch of bourbon in the barrel world and a Stellum specialty? And the difference is batches of bourbon don't have a framework for flavor profile. Batches of Stellum or the Stellum specialties are how do we polish and perfect the Stellum flavor profile of classic bourbon, classic rye in a way that we won't be able to recreate. And we do that in a step-by-step blending where we'll sort of add things and make it as good as we can and let it sit, bring it back into the lab, do tests, try to improve upon it, doing that over and over again. With the Stellum Fibonacci, it's a slightly different sequence because we had a I'll talk about this in a second, but a very specific blending ratio that we had to stick to. So it was about tasting different whiskeys in that ratio. But ultimately, we get to this point where we can't make it any better, and then we release it, and then when it's gone, it's gone. And there's 600 cases for the country or so. The Stellum Fibonacci rye is a rye whiskey that has 6 different components. So they were all blended before, but there's 6 components that we had in vats. And we just, as a company, developed this obsession with the Fibonacci sequence, which is also called the golden ratio.
Yep.
And each number is a sum of the 2 numbers before it.
Yep.
So it's 0, 1, 1, 2, 3,
Yep.
5, 8, so on and so forth. And there's so much balance in the natural world in the Fibonacci sequence. Like our brains see the Fibonacci sequence in color patterns, in building bricks, and like all this stuff. It just seems like balanced to us, even though the numbers don't sound like they're going to be. And we just had this, for years we've been talking about like, let's just make a Fibonacci. We were going to make it a secret at first, and it just fits so much into Stellum wanting to be this intersection of the science but also romanticism of putting whiskeys together, that having it be one of the first Stellum specialty blends was perfect for us. And it's been so fun for me talking about it because, and everyone who drinks Stellum Fibonacci sort of falls into one of three categories. There's the like, okay, cool, but I'm interested in the whiskey. And then there's the like, I hadn't thought of that. That's a cool story, but if the whiskey's what matters. And then there's like 5% of people who are like, fuck yeah, you guys are such nerds, and I love it. And like this was made for all three categories, like it was really made for the third category.
Because if you get the joke or you get the thing, then you're hooked.
And what's been really cool is we're developing, because we just released some other Stellum specialties. We released the Lone Cypress is the rye that's after this. That's an ode to the sort of smells and flavors and wind and just like feeling of the Monterey Peninsula in California. It's named after the famous tree, the Lone Cypress tree.
Yep.
It's allowed us to take inspiration from really specific things, but apply it to bourbon or to rye.
Okay.
In a way that's like, we know we're going to make 600 cases and it's going to be cool and we can move on. And that has been a new type of whiskey development for us, of like, we're going to get inspired by one specific thing that we can name, and we're going to blend a whiskey around that inspiration, and we're only going to blend it once and move on.
Gotcha.
That's been really cool too.
That's awesome.
And here, even though I love it by itself, we're drinking it in what would have been a quite expensive cocktail here.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers. So, question 3.
Yeah.
You guys are just about to turn 10.
Yep.
And so, you guys are now the largest. So I'm going to read my notes just because, again, I want to make sure I get it right. So you guys are the largest independent bottler in the U.S., correct?
As far as we know, yeah.
Could you talk more about the scaling up of volume of barrels purchased and released as the company grew?
So again, like I was talking about with Dovetail, there's been all of these sort of defining moments, both from a business and a planning standpoint and from a whiskey standpoint for us. And we're turning 10 because 2013 is when Joe launched the company. But we became a national company really in like 2015, 2016. And at that moment, we still were just barrel, bourbon, batch, blank. And then we started dabbling in single barrels really early on. I think there's some single barrels that have just a single number, like barrel number 1 through barrel number 22, I think it was, 24, that every once in a while I see a bottle out in the wild, and that's crazy. It's like the first 24 single barrels that we ever did. And then we started the whiskey series, but we were not a blending house. We were a make a whiskey and release it and move on and make another whiskey and release it. And we had to lay barrels down in that moment because we knew that we wanted to have them for the future, but we didn't have to think about barrels for multiple concepts that were going on far into the future, nailing flavor profiles the same way. It was really with batch 7, I think, which was the first time that we blended many different ages into a batch before. And people talk about batch 11 as the like when barrel bourbon got put on the map, but batch 7 actually won a huge award at the San Francisco.
Okay.
I think it was like best small batch, not best bourbon, so it's like in the finalists, but not. And that was the moment, the way that I remember it, that Joe's vision expanded from, I'm going to make great whiskey and release it, and then make another great whiskey and release it, to I'm going to work on making lots of great whiskeys at the same time and release them as I see fit. And that was when the investment in laying down barrels had to exceed in a huge way what we were releasing, because we were going to continue to grow. And we are, when you say we're the largest blender and bottler of spirits, the largest independently owned blender and bottler. There's non-distiller producers that are much bigger than we are, but they don't own themselves.
Right.
And part of that has been Joe's insistence on letting growth run, but knowing that growth is expensive and constantly investing in more and more barrels and looking at barrels not only for what we're going to release at the next moment, but when are we going to release how many of what groups of barrels we're buying. And at this point, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of barrels of so many mash bills from so many distilleries in so many places, because we're just investing in having the biggest spice cabinet. And it's like, imagine like a cute, very small version of the Diageo story where like Johnny Walker doesn't have a distillery. There were moments when in Johnny Walker's history when it was 2 or 3 or 4 distilleries. Diageo owns what? Mike, do you know? I don't know.
22 Scotch distilleries.
I thought it was more than that at that point.
Is it more now? It could be.
Yeah, and God knows how much interest they have in other ones, and there's hundreds of ingredients in the Johnny Walker blends now, but it's like they developed into that, and we're not trying to be Johnny Walker, but we are taking that, like, as we grow, our spice cabinet has to grow too.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And also, congratulations. All right. Question 4, drink 4.
Yeah.
What are we drinking?
Seagrass.
Fuck yeah.
So this is our top selling item. This is, even though Dovetail will always have a place in my heart in terms of what it did for our company and what it did for me professionally, Seagrass is another moment in the company's history that we sort of took a jump where we totally underestimated how much the whiskey drinking public of America has great taste. And we thought we were making this cerebral, nerdy rye whiskey that the theme of Seagrass is to make a coastal themed whiskey. So we wanted the brief for us as we were designing it conceptually and blending wise was something that you can like sit inside and look at a storm on the ocean, or you can like be under a blanket sitting on like a deck at a lake, or you can be in Miami Beach and it can be crushed ice, and it's a coastal whiskey for America, because the motif of whiskey in America is like cowboys, horses.
Yeah.
There's no like aquatic.
Right. You don't get that.
And so we just had this like, it was a concept whiskey, and we released it and it just blew up. And I was expecting all these questions. Finishes on Seagrass are apricot brandy, rum agricole, Moms of Madeira. I was expecting all these questions as I traveled around the country talking about it, like what is rum agricole, what is mom, and people who cared asked the questions, and then there's like 80% of the people who love Seagrass who like don't even read the other half of the bottle, which is great. I love that because it's just like it's objectively delicious. And so I think that we like underestimated how like you make a good whiskey and people drink it. And it's the top seller from us right now.
Yeah, it's again, like I said, from the Dovetail all the way to like this is, I mean, the two that are. It's the gateway drug into barrel. Like,
yeah, and it's interesting because this is actually the lightest of the 4 whiskeys
Yeah.
we've had so far, but I like to do it in this order with someone like you who's asking this type of question, because Seagrass is a blend of 3 different finishes, and that concept happened because of Armida that we're not tasting tonight, and because of Dovetail. And we are a company that is really dedicated to learning from our successes and like communicating with the whiskey world, whether it's the industry or consumers, and delivering what people want and what we think is cool. And I don't think Seagrass would have been possible or successful when we released Dovetail. Dovetail's a whiskey drinkers whiskey for whiskey drinkers. Seagrass is a like, you want some cool shit?
yeah.
But like we had the syntax within our own company put it together, and also the expectations and the curiosity of the whiskey drinking world changed between Dovetail and Seagrass, and it left us with this. And I think what's cool and what is, I'm trying to think of the right way to verbalize this, but one of the parts of my job that I find most like intellectually stimulating is working with Joe, who is so singular in his vision of things and like so ahead of what other people's analysis. Like Joe just gets there so much faster, in certain ways, like COVID started happening, and Joe immediately recognized that there was going to be a glass shortage. And so in a moment when it was very, very difficult from a production standpoint, we had already upped all of our glass orders. And I learned, like, that couple weeks of, like, is the world collapsing? What do we do with the company? Joe's, like, empathy for the employees and also foresight of what is actually going to happen was, I learned so much from him on that day, or that, like, couple weeks. And working with him on designing whiskeys where the purpose is to make it delicious. The purpose is to explain what you're going to get on the front of the bottle so that when you get the whiskey, you're not surprised or disappointed. But also, the purpose is to thread this needle where it is fascinating, but you want to finish the bottle and you want to drink more of it. When you're designing whiskeys, that's an extremely narrow place to be. There's so many whiskeys that are fascinating whiskey, but you want to buy the bottle and you want to, like, leave it on the shelf.
Sure.
And then there's seagrass where, like, I want to buy the bottle and I want to crush it. I want to make boulevardiers out of it. I want to seagrass and tonic. I want to make seagrass sours. I want to pour for my friends. And it's done, and then it's like, well, I still want a bottle of seagrass. I want another bottle of seagrass. And that is, there's 100 cool whiskeys that come out every year, and there's like 1 or 2 whiskeys that it's like, oh, I could just have this.
Right.
And like that is like what I'm most proud of our company for achieving with seagrass.
Well, again, I classify seagrass as I'm a big sneakerhead. So sneakerheads always, you buy one to stock, one to rock.
Yeah.
And that's the way I feel about seagrass, is that you buy one to stock, one to rock. You always have one that's always on the shelf, but there's always one open to drink and do whatever. Because again, it is one of those superb.
Well, thank you.
Goodness. All right, so question 4.
Yeah.
Not having age statements. Is that a hindrance or like a sense of freedom?
From a blending perspective, it's absolutely a sense of freedom. And I want to be really careful in my answer to this because I think there's a lot of noise where people in positions like mine talk about age statements as handcuffs, and it's just like you want to have younger whiskey and you don't want to admit it. And we're a company about transparency. There's not the old whiskey available that there ever always was, except that we have put down so much whiskey and we've saved a lot of old. We are not a company that is out of old whiskey in any way. What is important to us is that people buy and respect and want to drink and want to like appreciate our whiskey based on the things that we feel are important about it. And there's a strange, like, backwards looking thing that happens with age statements where people just want the old whiskey. We want them to like us for us. We don't want them to like us for the age statement.
Sure.
So there's like Dovetail Seagrass, old whiskeys in them. And in their whiskeys, so like the minimum age is 4 or else we'd have to say it, but like actually the base age of them is much older. But we're really dedicated to like, we want someone to like seagrass for seagrass. We don't want like someone to like seagrass because they love 10-year-old rye or whatever.
I guess that's where I was getting at with the question.
And with single barrels, it becomes kind of weird to not put the age statement on it because it's a single barrel. But with the blends, we need to nail the profile, and also with our philosophy about vatting ingredients, our goal is not to blend seagrass. Our goal is to blend the ingredients of seagrass. And because of that, each one of those ingredients has different tolerances for young versus old whiskey and oak versus not oak. And the finishing that goes into it and what whiskeys take those finishes well. Some of the finishes on especially the apricot brandy and seagrass, does not take oak very well. Okay. And so we use reasonably old Canadian rye in that, but what we really need is Canadian rye that tastes the way that it's supposed to taste to go into the apricot brandy to get that fruit forwardness, that like ground zero of apricot flavor to then use as an ingredient. And so it's a hindrance because we got to make it taste awesome. We're stricter than anyone else would be about it's not going to the bottle unless it tastes awesome. So I hope that's not dancing around it.
No, not at all. And sorry, go ahead.
There are moments where we feel like in order to explain what's in the bottle, the age statement is really important. And there's moments where we feel like to explain what's in the bottle, the age statement is going to give an impression of what matters to us that does not actually matter to us. It's why if you look at the batches of bourbon, our like most OG barrel, we used to be called Barrel Bourbon. My email address is at barrelbourbon.com, and all of the batches of bourbon have age statements on them. But the blends are much more about like, we are going to nail this flavor profile, and there's going to be so many ingredients in it, and the age statement is going to be misleading as to how old a lot of the whiskeys are, because there's also whiskeys that go into it to add proof or to add funk, and they aren't necessarily. And it's just like you only get to put one number on the age statement. So.
And then you talked a little bit about it before, and do you guys have like a direct like when you guys are picking your whiskey to blend? Do you have like a direct into the distillery, or do you use like a representative, or like how does that work?
All of the above. We work with brokers, we work directly with distilleries, we also work with brands that are distilleries but they source to begin with and then they're making the transition. We work with brokers that we don't know what we're buying, with brokers where we know exactly what we're buying. We have no contracts, so it's just like we're going to taste some selection or all of these barrels. We're going to make sure they're what we're looking for, and we're going to be a good partner, whether it's to the broker or back to the distillery, in terms of payment terms, respecting like confidentiality agreements, all those things, because all we care about is how the whiskey tastes.
Sure.
We don't care at all about where it came from, why it's available. Are you going to have more? Are you not going to have more? Is it available right now? Is it available in 6 months? Do you need us to take it? Can you store it for us? Can you not store it for us? It's like, does the whiskey taste good? And we're going to do cool stuff with it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I could sit here and drink Seagrass with you all day, so
Cheers.
cheers. Fifth and final drink. Fifth question.
Yeah.
What are we drinking?
So we're drinking Barrel Vantage, which is our newest release, but was just named number 3 whiskey of the year by Whiskey Advocate.
Putting their skills as blenders and cask finishers on display, the folks at Barrell Craft Spirits land at number 3 with Vantage.
It's a bourbon whiskey, so based on all the rules of bourbon, all we would have to call this is Barrel Vantage Bourbon. But we put all this stuff on the label anyway. We do a secondary maturation in Mizunara, or Japanese oak, French oak, and then toasted American oak. And then we blend it back together. Every vatting only sees one of those, and then blend together. It's not like it goes from one to the other. And so it is we've talked a lot about our like sort of perspective on the whiskey world. This is our vantage point on like, we wanted to have a bourbon. This is our bourbon. And we wanted to respect all of the rules of what go into making a bourbon. We didn't want to stray outside of that too much, but we wanted to expand the spectrum of flavor in bourbon in a way that we felt no one else could do. And so there's so many different mash bill distillery variations, and then also 3 different finishes on it. To me, it's like the most complex bourbon you could put together without being confusing. It's like, that's exactly what we want it to be, like fascinating but still bourbon. And it's been amazing. It's been 3.5 months, and like it's all anyone wants to drink. Because it's like a little bit of an oak bomb at first, but there's so much fruit behind it.
Yeah.
And it's so dense, especially after the Seagrass, which is so fruit forward but light.
Yeah.
Seagrass is like a light, sweet whiskey, and Vantage is a dense whiskey.
Dude, absolutely amazing. Question 5.
Yeah.
Comes down to flip the Whiskey Wednesday coin. You can flip it, you can spin it, you can do whatever you want, but the coin gives us the answer.
Okay.
You don't have to answer unless you want to, but the coin gives us the answer.
Okay.
So if you got your coin, it's all your mojo.
Okay.
Again, heavy as hell, can be it's a weapon or
I'll do a spin. We got a bar.
A little breast pocket protectee in case someone shoots you, but yeah.
We got a fuck no, fuck yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. So one of the things you haven't talked about is that you actually have 2 job titles at Barrell. Do you ever argue with yourself?
Oh man, I'll spin it, but I can all the time. I think that what is another thing that I love about my job and working with Joe and working for Barrell is there's always this tension between what's the best thing for now and what's the best thing for the future. And I get to wear both of those hats. similarly, I get to wear the what's cool and what could we do, and then I get to be in the meetings where like production and sales and marketing don't always get along in companies, and I get to be at a bunch of the meetings and argue with myself constantly, but also I feel like there's like I see both of the interests.
Sure.
And I think what is cool and unique about Barrell is Joe and his family, like it's a family-run business, have really instilled this like one team, one dream mentality where like the argument is always about what's best for the company, not what's like, oh, this is what I want to do. There's no like, F you, like I'm not going to do that. It's just like what's best for the company, and there's different perspectives based on different amounts of knowledge about what's possible in different departments. And usually what happens is like everyone makes concessions and we wind up putting out cool whiskey, and sometimes it's a little bit less than we would want, or a little bit later than we would want, or sometimes we sell more than we thought we were going to, or we sell less than we thought we were going to, and then we wind up more. But like ultimately the like guidelines of that are it's been successful. So I think that I agree with myself. Our company has its own like a bunch of people who are really smart, being given space to have input into the like direction of what's going on, and the arguments are like we're on the same team when we're arguing. It's like the you know
Okay.
Sometimes you need someone to start a fight with the other team
Yeah,
to motivate everyone else.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll spin that.
Yeah, please. Yeah, you did, but yeah. Very nice. Good spin, good spin. Fuck yeah!
Fuck yeah!
Amazing. Well, that's 5 questions answered, 5 drinks down. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
And
cheers.
I hope we can do this again very soon. So,
Yeah.
Cheers to you. Thank you for joining us. Mike, thank you for hosting. Come to Travel Bar and
Yeah.
to the future.
To the future.